moving into the new house felt like the beginning of something special. My older brother and mom were buzzing with excitement, eager to start fresh in a place they could finally call their own. The house itself was old, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to whisper stories of the past. It had character, as my mom would say, a charm that made it feel like more than just four walls and a roof. But even in their excitement, there was something unsettling in the air, a sensation that clung to the atmosphere like a faint, lingering odor. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. My mom felt it first, that strange, almost imperceptible feeling of being watched, of not being alone. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of the move. Yet, as they settled in, that feeling grew stronger. The house, with all its charm, seemed to hold a secret, one that lurked just beyond the edges of their perception. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the walls had witnessed things better left forgotten. My brother and mom tried to ignore it, focusing on the new beginning that lay ahead. But deep down, they both knew this house was more than it seemed. And whatever it was hiding, they were about to discover it. The house had a past, one that was seldom spoken of but always felt. It was in the hushed tones of the neighbors, the way their eyes would dart toward the backyard when they thought no one was looking. My brother and mom had heard whispers, but they didn't pay much attention until one evening, when the truth began to unravel. Years ago, they learned, a woman and her young child lived in that very house. It was an ordinary day when the tragedy struck. The woman was out in the backyard, hanging laundry as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Her child played nearby, laughing and chasing after a butterfly. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As she reached up to hang the last piece of clothing, her hand brushed against a wire, one that had somehow gone unnoticed. The jolt of electricity was immediate and violent, coursing through her body with a ferocity that left no chance for escape. She collapsed, her body convulsing, but it was the child's reaction that sealed their fate. Unaware of the danger, the child ran to her, small hands grasping at her mother, trying to help. The electricity surged again, and just like that, their lives were extinguished in a horrific instant. The backyard, where the sun once warmed the earth, became a place of shadows, of lingering grief. Neighbors whispered that they could still hear faint cries at night, the desperate calls of a mother and child forever trapped in that moment of terror. Some claimed to have seen fleeting figures in the dim light, a woman with outstretched arms, a child reaching up, both forever bound to the place where they had met their tragic end. It was said that their spirits never left, that the house had absorbed their pain, and now it oozed through the walls, a silent reminder of the horror that had taken place. My brother and mom tried to push these thoughts aside, but the weight of the past hung over them, heavy and oppressive. And as they learned more about the history of their new home, they couldn't help but wonder if the spirits of the mother and child were still there, watching, waiting, and perhaps trying to reach out. As my brother and mom settled into the house, they wanted to capture the beginning of their new life. With an old camera in hand, they wandered through each room, snapping photos of their new surroundings. The camera, with its familiar click and whir, brought a sense of nostalgia, a comfort in the midst of so much change. They laughed as they posed, imagining the future memories they would create within these walls. It was almost an afterthought when they decided to take a photo in the backyard. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the grass. My brother lifted the camera and framed the shot, the house standing tall and imposing in the background. As he pressed the shutter, the air seemed to grow colder, a sudden chill that prickled their skin. They laughed it off, blaming the evening breeze, and thought nothing more of it. Days later, when the photos were finally developed, they gathered around the prints, eager to relive the moment. Most were typical, showing the house from various angles, their faces smiling with the excitement of a fresh start. But one photo stopped them cold. It was the picture from the backyard, but something was horribly wrong. The image was blurred, almost burned around the edges, as if the film had been exposed to something unnatural. And in the center of the distortion were two shapes, one unmistakably a woman, her form slightly hunched, the other a smaller figure beside her, resembling a child. Their faces were indistinct, lost in a blur, but their presence was undeniable. My mom's hands trembled as she held the photograph. The figures seemed to be emerging from the shadows, caught in a moment of anguish, their forms twisted and wrong. My brother, usually so rational, felt a wave of unease wash over him. There was no logical explanation for what they were seeing, no reason for the image to be so distorted, so haunted. It was as if the camera had captured more than just a moment in time. It had somehow reached into the past, pulling forth the echoes of that tragic day. The figures in the photograph seemed to stare back at them, frozen in their final moments, a haunting reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. The moment my mom saw the photograph, her face drained of color. The joyful anticipation of their new life vanished, replaced by a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. She didn't need to look twice to know that something was terribly wrong. The air around them seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight, as if the figures in the photograph had brought the sorrow of their tragic end into the room. My mom turned pale when she saw it. I remember her telling me later. She was never one to scare easily, but this was different. She didn't want to believe what she was seeing, didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that the spirits of the woman and child might still linger in their new home. She told my brother, her voice trembling, to throw the photo away, to get rid of it before it could bring any more darkness into their lives. "We don't need that kind of energy in the house," she said, trying to sound firm, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. But my brother, he hesitated. He wasn't superstitious by nature, more inclined to find logical explanations for the unexplained. Yet, as he stared at the photo, something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figures were becoming clearer, more defined with each passing moment. It was as if the spirits trapped within the image were pushing against the boundaries of the photograph, trying to break free. My brother swore he could see the figures more clearly each time he looked at it, as if they were becoming more real. His mind raced, torn between curiosity and an overwhelming sense of dread. He wanted to understand, to rationalize what he was seeing, but there was a part of him, buried deep and desperate, that knew some things were better left unknown. Eventually, though, fear won. The urgency to rid themselves of the photograph became undeniable, like a fire that couldn't be quenched. My mom and brother, desperate to forget what they had seen, gathered the courage to destroy the photo. They tore it up, the pieces falling to the floor like ashes, as if they were erasing the spirits themselves. But as they did, the room grew colder, and for a moment, they swore they heard a faint, mournful whisper, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. They tried to erase the unsettling image from their minds, to pretend it had never happened. But deep down, they both knew that some things can never truly be forgotten, and that the spirits of the past might still linger, watching, waiting. A few days later, when my brother walked into the kitchen, his heart nearly stopped. There, lying on the kitchen table, was the photo, perfectly intact, as if it had never been torn to pieces. He froze, staring at it in disbelief. They had destroyed it, hadn't they? He remembered the sound of the paper tearing, the way the pieces had crumpled in their hands. But now, here it was, untouched and whole, as though it had never been discarded. My mom's fear turned into something darker, more primal. This wasn't just a ghost story or a strange coincidence. It was something far more sinister, something that didn't want to be forgotten. The air in the house grew heavy, thick with a presence they couldn't see but could feel all around them. Footsteps echoed through empty rooms, soft whispers filled the silence of the night, and no matter how many times they tried to rid themselves of the photo, it always found its way back. The tension in the house escalated with each passing day. Objects would move on their own, lights flickered without reason, and the temperature would drop suddenly, chilling them to the bone. But the worst was the photo. Every time they found it, the figures seemed to grow clearer, more defined, as if the spirits were drawing closer. One night, my brother woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. He had felt something, a presence, near him as he slept. His room was dark, the shadows thick and oppressive. He sat up, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then he saw it, the photo, lying on the floor beside his bed. But this time, something was different. The figures in the photo had changed. They were no longer distant, blurred shapes. They were closer, their forms sharper, clearer. And they weren't just standing in the background anymore. They were at the foot of his bed, their eyes, now visible, staring directly at him. The woman's face was twisted in sorrow, the child's expression one of silent pleading, as if they were reaching out to him from beyond the grave. Panic seized him. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. The photo seemed to pulse with life of its own, the figures almost stepping out from the frame. My brother could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, as if they were right there in the room with him. He shut his eyes, praying for it to end, for them to go away. When he opened his eyes again, the photo was gone. But the fear remained. The house that once promised new beginnings now felt like a tomb, a place where the past refused to stay buried. They left the house soon after, unable to endure the constant terror that plagued them. But even now, years later, my brother can't escape the memory of that night. He never found the photo again, but he swears that sometimes, in the dead of night, he can feel those eyes on him, watching, waiting. To this day, the house stands empty, abandoned, as if the spirits themselves have claimed it. And though the photo was never found, the haunting never truly ended. The memory of those figures, standing at the foot of his bed, still lingers in my brother's mind, a chilling reminder that some things are better left forgotten, but never truly are.